What if the passengers of the Titanic could have been saved? April 14, 1912. The world's greatest ocean liner is sinking. Panic spreads, lifeboats are lowered, and over 1,500 people are left behind in the freezing Atlantic. But then, hope. A ship is seen on the horizon, its lights glowing in the darkness. It's close. Close enough to see Titanic's distress rockets. Close enough to hear the frantic SOS calls. And yet, it does nothing. Why? Negligence? Miscommunication? A trick of the light? Over a century later, the mystery remains. Tonight, we uncover the truth about the ship that watched the Titanic sink, and did nothing. In April 1912, two ships set sail across the Atlantic, their fates unknowingly intertwined. The first, the RMS Titanic, was the pinnacle of luxury and engineering, a floating palace. At 269 meters long, with 16 watertight compartments and the latest technology, it was hailed as unsinkable. On board, 2,223 passengers and crew embarked on what was meant to be the most prestigious voyage of the era. The second, the SS Californian, was a much smaller, humbler vessel. Built not for grandeur but for practicality, it carried 47 passengers and 55 crew, primarily transporting cargo like cotton and raw materials. Unlike the Titanic, it had no lavish ballrooms, no grand staircase, just a reliable, sturdy frame designed for business, not fame. Though vastly different in scale and prestige, these two ships followed eerily similar paths. On April 5th, the Californian left Liverpool, bound for Boston. 5 days later, on April 10th, the Titanic set sail from Southampton, making brief stops in Cherbourg, France and Queenstown, Ireland, before heading toward New York. Both ships followed well-traveled transatlantic routes, and soon, their courses converged at a critical point known as the Corner, a navigational marker in the North Atlantic where vessels adjusted their bearings toward their final destinations. But there was one more connection between them, a little-known fact that history often forgets. The Californian was owned by the Leyland Line, a sister company to the White Star Line, which operated the Titanic. Two ships, linked by the same maritime family, sailing toward an inevitable tragedy neither would ever escape. By 1912, a revolutionary invention was transforming maritime travel wireless telegraphy. For the first time, ships could communicate instantly across vast distances, sending messages over the airwaves instead of relying on slow, outdated signal lamps. Both the Titanic and the Californian were equipped with this cutting-edge Marconi wireless system, but how they used it made all the difference. Aboard the Titanic, two experienced radio operators worked in shifts to keep communications running 24/7. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, had 6 years of experience, while his assistant, Harold Bride, had been working with Marconi for 9 months. Their primary duty? Relaying passenger telegrams, business transactions, personal messages, anything that connected first-class travelers with the outside world. On the Californian, however, there was just one man handling the wireless, Cyril Evans, a 20-year-old operator with only 6 months of experience. He worked alone, meaning that at night, once he turned off his equipment, the ship fell silent. April 14, 7:30 p.m. The Californian is surrounded by ice. Evans, knowing the dangers, sends a message to nearby ships, including the Titanic, warning them of a vast ice field ahead. The message reaches Jack Phillips on the Titanic, but there's a problem. Phillips is overwhelmed. The Titanic's radio had broken down the day before, and now, after hours of repairs, he's struggling to catch up on a backlog of passenger telegrams. Every minute counts. Then Evans's message arrives. Shut up, I'm working Cape Race." Phillips snaps at Evans, annoyed by the interruption. It's a common exchange between radio operators. Shorthand for, "I'm busy, don't disturb me." On the Californian, Evans shrugs it off. He's done for the night. At 11:30 p.m. he turns off the radio and goes to bed. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic, because Evans had made one critical mistake, one detail that history often forgets. When he sent his iceberg warning, he forgot to mark it as MSG, a Master Service Gram. This official code would have required Phillips to immediately deliver the message to Titanic's captain, forcing him to take it seriously. Instead, without that crucial designation, the warning was dismissed, lost in the sea of commercial messages. And now, just minutes from disaster, the Titanic was speeding straight into the ice, with no idea what lay ahead. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic meets its fate. The lookouts perched high above the decks suddenly spot a massive iceberg dead ahead. There's no time. The bridge orders a hard turn to port, the engines reverse, but it's too late. The iceberg rips open 5 compartments along the Titanic's starboard side. If only 4 had flooded, she might have survived. But as the freezing Atlantic rushes in, chief designer Thomas Andrews does the calculations. The ship has less than 3 hours before it disappears beneath the waves. Aboard the Titanic, panic spreads. Distress rockets are fired. The wireless operators send frantic SOS signals into the night, hoping for an answer, and then, someone spots lights on the horizon. A ship. A glimmer of hope. Survivors later describe it in chilling detail, a vessel, sitting motionless in the distance, close enough to see Titanic's flares, but not moving. Some lifeboats even row toward it, convinced that rescue is near. That ship was the SS Californian. On the Californian, Second Officer Herbert Stone stands watch. Around midnight, he notices strange lights on the horizon. He isn't sure what he's looking at, but soon, something even more startling happens. White rockets explode in the sky. Stone calls Apprentice Officer James Gibson to the deck. Together, they count 6 rockets fired at irregular intervals. This should have been a clear distress signal, yet they hesitate. Why? At the time, white rockets were not exclusively distress signals. In some cases, ships used them for communication, especially between vessels of the same company. To Stone and Gibson, this could have been a routine signal between 2 ships, nothing more. Still, they feel uneasy. Around 1:15 a.m. they finally decide to wake their captain. Captain Stanley Lord, resting in the chart room, is informed that a ship is firing rockets, but the details are vague. How many rockets? What color? Are they distress signals or just communication flares? Stone isn't sure. Lord's reaction is shockingly indifferent. He asks if the ship looks like it's moving. No, sir, it appears stationary. To Lord, this confirms his assumption. If a ship were sinking, it would not stay still. His decision? Do nothing. Instead of turning on the radio and checking for SOS messages, instead of ordering his crew to investigate, he assumes that if there were real trouble, someone would have signaled them directly. He never gives the order to assist. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic vanishes beneath the ocean. Hundreds of people are left floating in the freezing waters, waiting for a rescue that never comes. Aboard the Californian, the lights on the horizon disappear. The officers watch, confused. The ship they had been observing is simply gone. And yet, no one reacts. No urgency, no radio check, no lifeboats launched. It isn't until hours later, when the Californian's radio is switched back on, that they hear the devastating truth. The Titanic is gone, lives have been lost, and they had been the closest ship to the disaster. But what if I told you the iceberg wasn't invisible because of bad luck, but because of a natural optical illusion? One so deceptive that it may have sealed the Titanic's fate before she ever struck the ice. On the night of April 14, 1912, an invisible force was working against the Titanic, something that no one aboard could see or predict. A rare atmospheric phenomenon, known as a superior mirage, may have played a crucial role in the disaster, distorting the perceptions of both the Titanic's lookouts and the crew of the Californian. This theory, extensively researched by historian Tim Malton in Titanic: A Very Deceiving Night, suggests that an optical illusion disguised the iceberg, made the Titanic appear farther away, and scrambled visual signals between the ships, all factors that contributed to the catastrophe. A superior mirage happens when cold air near the ocean's surface is trapped beneath a layer of warmer air above, creating a sharp temperature inversion. That night, the Titanic had just entered the frigid waters of the Labrador Current, which clashed with the warmer Gulf Stream. This inversion bent the light in a way that warped the horizon, creating a false skyline and distorting objects in the distance. For the Titanic's lookouts, this was devastating. The iceberg should have been visible against the night sky, but instead, the mirage made it blend in with the false horizon. This explains why they spotted it only at the last moment, when it was already too late to avoid impact. Meanwhile, on the Californian, officers were observing the Titanic from afar, but due to the mirage, it appeared much farther away than it actually was. The bending of light made the Titanic's lights seem lower on the horizon, making it look like a much smaller vessel, not a massive liner in distress. This false perception may explain why Captain Lord dismissed reports of a nearby ship firing rockets. He simply didn't believe it was close enough to be in trouble. The mirage also interfered with communication. Both the Titanic and the Californian attempted to communicate using Morse lamps, flashing signals in a last attempt to establish contact. However, the atmospheric distortion likely scrambled these signals, making them incomprehensible. To the Californian's officers, the Titanic's desperate flashes may have seemed random, flickering nonsense, reinforcing the belief that nothing was wrong. This optical illusion may have been one of the most tragic factors of that night. It hid the iceberg from sight, convinced the Californian that the Titanic was further away, and scrambled visual distress signals, ensuring that when help was needed most, it never came. By the time the illusion lifted, the Titanic was gone, and with it over 1,500 souls. Tragedies rarely happen because of a single mistake. More often, they result from a series of small miscalculations and misjudgments, each one leading to the next, like dominoes falling in sequence. The Titanic's fate was not sealed by the iceberg alone, it was cemented by a chain of human errors, both aboard the Titanic and on the Californian, the one ship that might have changed everything. The first mistake came hours before the Titanic even struck the iceberg. At 7:30 p.m. Cyril Evans, the Californian's lone radio operator, sent a message warning of a massive ice field ahead. But he made a critical error. He forgot to mark the transmission with the code MSG, which would have classified it as an official captain's message. Without this designation, Jack Phillips, the Titanic's senior radio operator, treated it as routine chatter, especially since he was buried under a backlog of passenger telegrams. Phillips snapped back, "Shut up! Shut up! I'm working Cape Race!" Evans, frustrated, turned off the Californian's radio and went to bed at 11:30 p.m., just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. Then came the second failure, the misinterpretation of the Titanic's distress signals. At 12:45 a.m., the first white distress rockets exploded over the Titanic, lighting up the night sky. Aboard the Californian, Second Officer Herbert Stone was on watch and noticed the flares. He called Apprentice Officer James Gibson to confirm what he was seeing. Together, they counted 6 rockets fired at irregular intervals. This should have been a clear sign of distress, but instead, they hesitated. At the time, maritime protocol for distress signals was vague. White rockets could indicate an emergency, but they were sometimes used for ship-to-ship communication. Stone and Gibson debated the meaning but did not act immediately. The third and most damaging failure was their reluctance to wake Captain Lord decisively. At 1:15 a.m., they finally informed him that a ship was firing rockets. But their uncertainty in relaying the urgency caused Lord to minimize the situation. From his perspective, no one had used the radio to contact them, and the ship in question appeared stationary. He assumed that if there was real trouble, someone would reach out directly. But of course they couldn't, because Evans, the only operator, was asleep, and his radio was off. By the time the Californian's crew realized something was wrong, it was too late. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic, taking unimaginable amount of lives. The mistakes had been small, the consequences were unimaginable. The Titanic was gone. At 2:20 a.m., after breaking apart, the great ship disappeared beneath the freezing Atlantic. Hundreds of passengers and crew were left struggling in the icy water, hoping for a rescue that would never come. But as the screams of the dying echoed across the sea, another ship was racing toward them, one that wasn't the Californian. Instead, it was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner nearly 60 miles away. At 12:25 a.m., just after the Titanic fired its first distress rocket, Carpathia's radio operator Harold Cottam was preparing to go to bed. By sheer chance, he decided to check for messages one last time. That's when he intercepted a transmission from the Titanic's radio room. "Come at once, we have struck an iceberg." Unlike the Californian, the Carpathia's radio was still on, and Cottam's reaction was immediate. He rushed to wake Captain Arthur Rostron, who, unlike Captain Lord, didn't hesitate. Rostron immediately changed course, ordering his crew to prepare for mass casualties. Despite knowing the waters were treacherous, he pushed Carpathia to full speed, forcing his engineers to work dangerously beyond the ship's limits. But even at top speed, the Carpathia was still hours away. At the same time, the Californian remained motionless. Even as Titanic's last lights flickered out, Captain Lord never turned on his radio, never gave orders to investigate. His ship, only 10 nautical miles away, was the closest to the disaster, but made no effort to intervene. By the time the Californian finally switched its radio back on at 5:30 a.m., it was too late. The Titanic had been at the bottom of the ocean for over 3 hours. The Carpathia had already arrived and was rescuing the 706 survivors drifting in lifeboats. The world soon learned the horrifying truth. The Californian had been within reach of the Titanic the entire time. As news of the disaster spread, public outrage erupted. How could the Californian have been so close yet done nothing? Two separate inquiries, one in the United States and one in Britain, were launched to investigate the Californian's inaction. The findings were damning. The British inquiry concluded that if the Californian had responded immediately to the Titanic's rockets, many more lives could have been saved. The ship could have picked up survivors directly from the decks before the Titanic sank. Captain Lord fought to clear his name, insisting that his ship had never been close enough to the Titanic to intervene. He even produced his logbook, showing a position further away than the survivors had claimed. But there was one problem. His logbook had been altered. The evidence suggested that the Californian had drifted southward during the night, pushed by the current, bringing it much closer to the Titanic than Lord had admitted. Whether intentional or not, his calculations were wrong, and that error destroyed his reputation forever. Captain Lord was never officially charged, but his career never recovered. He left the Leyland Line, never commanded a major ship again, and died in obscurity in 1962, still insisting that history had judged him unfairly. The Titanic wasn't the only ship doomed that night. Just a few years later, the Californian met its own tragic end. During World War I, it was torpedoed by a German U-boat while sailing near Greece. The ship sank quickly, disappearing beneath the waves, just like the Titanic had. Even more eerie, the Californian's wreck lies not far from the resting place of the Britannic, Titanic's sister ship, which also sank in the same war. Two ships, forever tied to the same disaster. One condemned by inaction, one lost to history. But the Titanic's story was far from over. The lessons learned that night would change maritime law forever. The sinking of the Titanic was more than just a disaster. It was a wake-up call. The deaths of over 1,500 people revealed serious flaws in maritime safety, and the world was determined to never let this happen again. The tragedy forced shipping companies, governments, and naval experts to confront a brutal truth. The system had failed, and change was needed. One of the most shocking revelations was that the Titanic had lifeboats for only about 1/3 of its passengers. At the time, lifeboats were seen as a way to transfer people to rescue ships, not as a means of total evacuation. No one had considered the possibility that a massive liner could sink so quickly. In response, new laws required all ships to carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard, an obvious rule that should have existed long before. But even more important was the radio reform. The Titanic's SOS signals had reached multiple ships, yet the only one close enough to save more lives, the Californian, never heard them because its radio operator had gone to bed. This was unacceptable. In 1912, the Radio Act was passed, making it mandatory for all ships to maintain 24-hour radio watch, ensuring that no distress call would ever go unanswered again. Another major reform came in 1914 with the creation of SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea, a set of international maritime laws that still exist today. SOLAS standardized emergency procedures, lifeboat drills, and iceberg monitoring, ensuring that every ship, no matter how large, was prepared for disaster. The Titanic's sinking also changed the way ships navigated dangerous waters. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol, IIP, was formed, monitoring the North Atlantic for icebergs. This patrol, still active today, ensures that no ship will ever again unknowingly steam into a field of ice like the Titanic did. Perhaps the most poignant change was the new distress signal itself. Before the Titanic sank, CQD was the standard call for help, but after the disaster, SOS became universal, shorter, clearer, and unmistakable. It was a direct result of Titanic's final radio transmissions, a haunting reminder of how technology could have saved more lives if only it had been used properly. The Titanic's legacy is not just a tale of tragedy, it is a lesson written in blood. Every modern safety measure at sea, every lifeboat drill, every iceberg patrol owes its existence to that terrible night in 1912. The Titanic changed history, not just in its sinking, but in the lives it saved, long after it was gone. The sinking of the Titanic remains one of the most haunting tragedies in history, but even more than a century later, its story continues to evolve. Beyond the shipwreck, beyond the loss of all those lives, there are tales of unbelievable survival, long-lost identities, and mysteries that took decades to unravel. One of the most famous survival stories belongs to 𝐼𝐸𝐵𝐿, the Titanic's chief baker. Unlike most who fell into the freezing waters of the Atlantic, he survived for nearly 2 hours in the ice-cold sea, longer than anyone should have. His secret? Alcohol. As the Titanic was sinking, 𝐸𝐮𝐻 helped passengers onto lifeboats, but refused to board one himself. Instead, he went back to his cabin and drank heavily, consuming whiskey to calm his nerves. When the ship finally disappeared beneath the waves, he jumped into the water and kept swimming. The freezing ocean should have killed him within minutes, yet somehow, he remained conscious and mobile. Whether it was the alcohol in his system preventing shock or pure adrenaline, 𝐸𝐮 managed to keep his head above water until he was pulled into a lifeboat hours later. He would go on to live until 1956, becoming one of the most famous survivors of the disaster. But he wasn't the only one to escape the Titanic's fate. Another remarkable survivor was Violet Jessop, a name now legendary among Titanic historians. We covered her unbelievable story in one of our previous facts videos, but as a reminder, this woman survived not one but 3 maritime disasters. She was on the Olympic when it crashed, on the Titanic when it sank, and on the Britannic when it struck a mine during World War I. Somehow each time she walked away alive. Her story, like 𝐸𝐮's, is almost too incredible to believe. But what about those who weren't so lucky? What became of the hundreds of bodies left behind after the Titanic vanished beneath the waves? In a previous video we explored one of the most forgotten parts of the Titanic's aftermath, the fate of its victims. A single ship, the 𝐬𝐫𝐽, was sent on a grim mission to recover the bodies drifting in the open ocean. Over the course of several days, hundreds were pulled from the water, identified and buried. But not all of them were brought home. Many were left to sink into the abyss, lost to time forever. And yet, even those lost at sea were not forgotten. Decades after the disaster, one mystery remained unsolved: the identity of a small child recovered by the 𝐬𝐫𝐽. For years no one knew her name. She was buried in Halifax, known only as the unknown child. But in the early 2000s, thanks to advancements in DNA analysis, researchers were finally able to identify her. Her name was Sydney Leslie Goodwin, a 2-year-old English girl traveling with her family in 3rd class. None of them survived, but after nearly a century, her name was restored, and her story was finally told. Even today, the Titanic's story is still unfolding. New discoveries are being made, new pieces of the past are coming to light, and the legacy of that fateful night continues to evolve. Over a century later, the Titanic still speaks to us, through its survivors, through its wreckage, and through the mysteries that may never be fully answered. Do you think Captain Lord was guilty, or was he just a victim of miscommunication? Let me know in the comments, and hit the subscribe button for more interesting unknown histories.